And I started working at Battersea Power Station as a consultant in 2008. So I know a lot of the stories. In fact, I'll probably have a snooze when he goes through his bit, because I think I've heard it about 600 times, and that's probably not an over-exaggeration. I think there are few better people to talk to you about the history of Battersea Station. One other person, maybe Sarah Banham in the back there, who's I think the longest-serving member of staff at Battersea Power Station back in the day. But Gordon was the head of planning at the power station, is a town planner by profession, 20 years across various different parts of London, including at Southwark, working for Boris, and then at the power station, navigating it through pretty extraordinary processing, really the biggest planning application in London at the time, and a planning award, right? Multiple planning awards for the power station. Dave is a developer. 20 years a developer, worked for Treasury Holdings, the Irish developer who actually got the planning permission that was then delivered, and worked for them in China before coming back to the UK and navigating it through that first planning permission, and then staying on when it was taken over by the Malaysians and then started to delivery. At the point at which phase one opened, Dave then came with me. We set up the business that we did, taking the lessons that we learned at Battersea Power Station about how to create a successful, complex mixed-use project and deliver it around the world. And we've done that over the last 8 years, working on hundreds of millions of square feet, telling people about what was successful about Battersea Power Station. So you're going to hear all the bad bits about all the difficulties that happened and all the stuff behind the scenes, but hopefully learn a thing about how do you deliver something of that complexity. So,
thank you very much, William. Good evening, everyone. I am Gordon Adams, and I'm just going to move this across to the side. I spent 12 years of my career working on a lot of that with Dave, so it's great to be reunited with him. So the title we were given was how did it happen, which is a short, simple question, which has a slightly longer answer. But I often say to understand where we are today, you have to understand where we've come from. So a lot of what I'll be doing is looking back, right back initially, a bit of background, a bit of history, a bit of heritage, and then the attempts at redevelopment that failed, which then informed the next owner, and then the next owner, and then ultimately the successful owner, as to how we were able to be successful. But if you want a one-page summary of the entire thing, that's it. It is a Grade 2 star-listed heritage global icon. 3 failed attempts, very heroic, but ultimately unsuccessful attempts. There have been 4 owners. This presentation in Australia recently, that's why I had to change it to metric, but 9 million square foot master plan, decommissioned in 1983, opened to the public in 2022, and was once described as the Everest of real estate. So in terms of its heritage, it's actually 2 power stations, Station A and Station B. So you've got a picture there of Station A on its own. Station A started 1929, operational 1933 and complete 1935. Station B started in 1937, but then stopped because of the war breaking out. And the last chimney wasn't finished until 1955. And Station A was decommissioned in 1975, so it's only fully operational for about 20 years. But even when it was being proposed, it was, it's a global icon now, but when it was being proposed, it wasn't very popular. I've been told someone has seen the minutes of the Chelsea Society objections from the 1920s on this coal-fired power station that was being proposed on their doorstep. But over time, that sort of initial objection then transformed into extreme affection. And a lot of that was from cultural aspects of, like, for example, the Pink Floyd album cover of 1977. That one. And then to the extent that in 1980 it was listed, so that was on the back of I haven't started my timer, which is great, on the back of the overnight demolition of the Firestone factory, which was an amazing Art Deco Firestone factory, which was, they thought they were going to get listed, so they demolished it, and so Michael Heseltine went on a listing spree, and Battersea Power Station was included in that, and then decommissioned in 1983. So therein starts the attempts at what to do with this amazing building. There were 3 very ambitious attempts at redevelopment. First one was by this guy, John Broome, who wanted to turn Battersea Power Station into a theme park. He owned Alton Towers theme park. So he had it from 1986 to 1993. And a lot of what he did had implications for those of us that came after. He went in with all the machines and started stripping it all out, but ran into trouble. It's a very simplistic way of describing it. But ultimately, he was brought down by costs. One of his challenges was he had the expensive bit, which was the power station, but not land around it to have development to help pay for it. I read an article where his son was quoted as saying, it's a bit hard when even your own bank goes into administration. So the early 90s was not a good time to be in real estate. Anyway, he went under, banks called in loans. Next up was Parkview International. It was run by a guy called Victor Huang, who's a Taiwanese, Hong Kong-based businessman. And as you can see, he had it for 13 years. He didn't really touch the building, but what he did, which was really important, was land assembly. So he added the Spicer Cowan warehouse to the west, railway land to the south, Thames Water land to the east, and then got planning permission for a 4 million square foot master plan, which was critical in terms of that generating income to pay for a now sort of half demolished power station. However, the story goes is that it was his father who had all the money and he passed away, and his siblings mounted a boardroom coup to put that ridiculous vanity project in London on the market. So they did, and in 2006, just before the financial crisis, it was bought by Treasury Holdings, an Irish company, who set about a new master plan. They added land as well, so each owner has added land, including the current owners. And they got a master plan approved. However, unfortunately for them, the banks also called in the loans on them, and that was in December 2011. So by this stage, that was 3 owners and 30 odd years, and so books were being written. These were the various schemes. So that was the theme park, that was Victor's scheme. That was the initial Treasury Holdings proposal, which is the Eco Dome. I think that may have had Dave's fingerprints on it. Funnily enough, after that proposal, the listing was upgraded to Grade 2 star. And then during administration, even Chelsea Football Club had a go. So by this stage, there was a lot of doubt. That was the sense. This is when I joined the project, and I can remember joining it, and the biggest challenge was doubt. Everyone said, oh, it's another owner, it's the Malaysians this time. It will never happen. And that was certainly the sense in the industry. But that's the state it was in. And along came the 4th owners, a Malaysian consortium, fixer-upper, and they were ultimately successful. And you see the image there of what's been achieved. And a huge amount has been achieved. It was hitting the ground running, and delivery was the key word. It was making up for lost time, building momentum, and to try and overcome those doubts. So what's been delivered, phase 1, which is a residential-led scheme, was first out of the blocks and has been built and delivered. The power station is phase 2. Phase 3, the bulk of that has been delivered. There's an element that recently got planning to hopefully complete that phase. Phase 4A, which is affordable housing, has been delivered early. And the Northern Line extension. So a huge amount. That's half the master plan. There's still another 3.5 million square feet to go. But in terms of delivery, it was objectively a success. So one of the key reasons why this was a success and previous owners had a challenge, one of the problems with Victor's scheme is the 4 million square foot master plan. You look at all the CGIs, they're very nice, they're very glossy, but they show nothing around the site. That's because around the site were sheds. Sheds or waste transfer stations or gas holders. It was a bit grim. So this is a good example of a policy lever being pulled that is actually quite effective. You can see at the moment with the government change in inventing grey belt, it's had an immediate effect and it's being tangible. this was a change where all the industrial area from Battersea Park down to Lambeth Park, well, to Vauxhall, was changed from industrial to an opportunity area. So prioritising jobs and homes, so 20,000 new homes, 25,000 new jobs. That was a game changer because it meant it wasn't just Battersea trying to deliver an amazing scheme in a sort of bad neighbourhood, but actually being brought along with all these other schemes that were being developed, and it also helped in terms of the transport solution. So the image on the top shows you what it was in terms of land ownership. One of the benefits of one of the benefits of industrial sites is they're usually quite large, so fewer owners to come together. And then the image in the bottom is an extract from the planning framework, which shows the future and how it's being delivered. But there was no limited public transport, so low public transport accessibility level. So the Northern Line extension was proposed. There was a development infrastructure funding study, multi-stakeholder engagement. This was across the board. You had two local boroughs, one was Labour, one was Conservative, both signing up. You had TfL saying we will deliver the tube. You had the GLA taking out £1 billion loan. You had the government creating an enterprise zone to capture business rates to help repay the loan. And you had the Chancellor guaranteeing the loan. So a textbook case of collaboration and multi-stakeholder engagement. And if one person didn't play their part, nothing would have happened. And a lot of social infrastructure allocation, green space allocation. So this is probably the bit to dwell on before I hand over to Dave. In my world, in terms of tangible, what we delivered, 600 odd planning applications, 12 legal agreements, and those are just the planning ones. There are multiple other ones. And just a constant, relentless delivery. I did a speech for the chairman before I left, where we pinpointed four sort of reasons for success. Shared objectives, collaboration, a progressive planning framework. I'd written a light planning framework, probably more to my thinking, and determination. Now, the chairman of the board would say that determination was obviously the shareholders, and that's without doubt. But I think it was determination from every party, which ties into the shared objectives and the collaboration, because you had different political leaders from different parties at different levels, different organisations, all coming from a different perspective, but it's that shared objective that ultimately everyone was working towards, which was restoring the power station, delivering the Northern Line extension, and making the opportunity area work. And everyone worked together collaboratively to achieve that. And that collaboration was evident. And when that happens, you can achieve great things. Like one anecdote of many. There was the election in 2016 for a new mayor, and that's always filled with uncertainty. So you try and get things through before a change. And we were already working on the waste transfer station application, which we knew had to go through. And then there was another one where we needed to make an amendment to our master plan. And my advice to the CEO at the time was, there's no time to do all of it. We can only do a stage one response from the GLA. And we met with the outgoing deputy mayor, and he said, if you want my advice, that's not worth the paper it's written on, you need a stage two. So afterwards, the CEO looked at me and said, well, there's your program. So we mobilised the team, we prepared a planning application, we lodged it, we went to consultation, we got a stage one, we went to planning committee, we got a stage two in 6 weeks. I mean, that is a phenomenal amount of time for an amendment to a 9 million square foot scheme. So it proves it can be done. And what I would say is that at the moment, what is evident is when there is no political support, you get inertia. It might not be overt, but it filters down, and it means you don't get delivery. Things don't happen. And I think Battersea is a good example of when people come together, amazing things can be achieved. I think that is me handing over to Dave.
So Gordon has basic CAMS, spoke nice and quietly and calmly and slowly. I put way too many slides in here. I'm also Irish, I'm going to go like the clappers. So even if you catch half of it, you're probably doing okay. I worked in Power Station 08 to 18. As William said on the back of that, we kind of spun a company out to take some of the lessons, both positive and negative, that we learned from the endeavour that Gordon talked about around the world. Gordon talked about the history. What I'll talk about is that once you have that kind of permission and that weight behind you, then how you start to create a place and how we went through phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 and the strategy behind that. Gordon talked a little about the building and how it sat like this right up until sort of 2012. And obviously it's being delivered now, the power station at the centre, phase 1, and then the buildings to the south of that and the tube connections. Had this sort of amazing industrial legacy, and obviously we know the architecture, and Gilbert Scott was brought on board because there were so many objections about the building and how it would, contaminate the air, the water, that the paintings in the National Gallery would be destroyed by this element. So it was brought, this architectural Art Deco style was brought on board to kind of appease that and to kind of help, and it's created sort of that legacy with it. And then Gordon talked about the sort of the mid-stage, it's midlife when it was decommissioned, and it moved from that sort of industrial heritage to more kind of cultural heritage, where the more the building, particularly after this in 77, the more the building was unused, different events would happen here. To have 40 acres in central London to have an event, people used to come to these events, so it kind of took on a different sort of cultural legacy. But then it also had the negatives, the stories written that this would never happen. As recently as 2012, when this was put up for sale, the Irish company who I'd worked for and then transitioned to the Malaysians, not one UK company bid to buy the power station in 2012. It was Zone 1, and it had full planning permission because they thought it would never happen as recently as that. So it took some of the Malaysians to come on board almost without the legacy of the, oh my God, this will never happen, with a new sort of optimism thinking it could actually happen. And I'm not going to talk about the technical bits, the 4,000 apartments and office space for 10,000 people and the restaurants and bars and cafes, because a lot of developers are good at doing that. They buy a site and they know, I need 4,000 apartments, I need a bit of retail, I need 2 hotels, I need an office, and that'll have to be paid for it. But they don't know how to turn that Excel spreadsheet, that appraisal, into a living thing more than just a series of buildings. And so we ran this process, and Sarah was involved as well, in terms of interviewing people. We broke into themes about the future of living, the future of work, the future of retail, back in sort of 2010. And we ended up writing this book, which is a place book, 260 pages. I don't recommend that you write 260 pages about the future of development, but we had to go through this cathartic process almost to kind of figure out finally why it had failed and what would ultimately happen here. And so we ended up with these 10 manifesto points. And everybody across the design team, probably 8,000 people working on the site, 800 consultants, 150 internal staff, they all were on the same trajectory because they knew what the vision was to deliver it. And that led to every brief and every architectural design, marketing materials came out of that sort of single vision, which was critical. I won't go into the detail, but it basically said, look, that culture, heritage and experience are the anchors. This idea of having a sort of mixed-use development set around the protection of the power station, and also owning the sustained long-term where you can curate the public realm to create a place that anchors the sort of neighbourhood was the sort of objective. And it's not important that there could have been, that was our vision. There's never one vision for a site. A site can have a number of different visions. The important thing is to understand what you're doing and then execute it on it with confidence and see it all the way through. And we obviously went for this mixed-use scheme. Somebody could have come along and said, actually, do you know what? It could all be residential, 100% residential with 50% affordable, no tube, and they could have turned the power station to a park. And it would have been an amazing thing, but it would have been something different. The thing is just to set out that vision at the outset and to deliver to it. As Gordon said, the first 3 phases have been delivered. There's still another 4 million square feet to come over the next 10 years. It's only halfway on this development, but a large amount of the public-facing elements have been delivered, particularly the power station, which I'll kind of go over quickly because I think it's actually phase 1 I want to talk about a bit more. But the power station is the centerpiece, the park at the front. So yes, you had to create development around it that sort of blocks some of the views, but the protection of that view to the north across the park to the river created this amazing public space for activation. The 2 turbine holes, 32, and built in the 50s post-war, 2 different characters because of the sort of the money that was around the Art Deco styling pre-war, and then the second power station built back to back in the 50s, much more austere, but it creates these different environments within the building itself. It is, it is 2 power stations back to back that work independently. And when you have this sort of void 2 million square feet, you all know the Tate Modern, the Tate Modern, same turbine hole, same scale, the 6 gallery floors of galleries aside, the chimney starts here and ends here. That is Tate Modern pre the extension. That is the other Tate Modern on the other side, and that's St. Paul's between the two. That's the scale. It's 6 times bigger than the volume of the Tate Modern. And so we have Apple's headquarters at the top, these offices with residential, and in the centre then we've got sort of event space and the cinemas, and then the retail and the restaurants and bars and cafes using the 2 turbine halls as a circulation space, up one and down the other. Again, I'm thinking most of you probably be in the building. Amazing historic spaces, retain the 2 control rooms, one for event space, one for a cocktail bar. Whimsical things like a chimney lift, getting people in and up through the building as a sort of visitor experience with the history of the power station, the museum at the bottom. A large amount of retail. You know, anybody who knows anything about retail, it's been decimated retail in the last 10 years. It's the retracting element, online retail. But actually what we're seeing is the most successful retail places are those that are experience-based. Why would you shop online, or why wouldn't you shop online unless you're getting experience of going to the shops? I think it's those best-in-class places that are being successful. So the retail team have leased this up through COVID in the middle of retail apocalypse to show that actually the success they had. And Zara opening, you know, one of the biggest stores in Europe here, while probably closing 20 to 30 stores across the country at the same time, because that flight to quality and that experience commitment. And again, all that set around the turbine halls, the control rooms, the activation of those spaces. Apple's headquarters sitting above that. Again, when we started out, we wanted to bring office space. We didn't want to create a single-use residential development, kind of like you see across the rest of Nine Elms. We know we needed workers. You need at least 5,000 to 10,000 workers there every day to support the retail. Otherwise, you can't have retail because you only have residents at weekends. So you had to bring it in. We knew it would be the hardest sell because Norman Foster and Wandsworth Council were the 2 biggest employers in Wandsworth. It was never a workplace destination. Wandsworth. So it was a big leap of faith, and it was that vision of long-term curation, of staff enjoyment, but also with the identity of the building that attracted Apple to this place. And then that curation is a huge bit. Having the public space and the events that the team put on all the time, from the sort of summer games that are on, to the light festivals, to the winter festival with the ice skating rink and all the events having, continuously having events that will draw people to site that then ultimately they might live there, they might work there, they might move an office there, or they might just spend time in the retail. And it had 11 million visitors the first year, 12 million the second year, so moving on towards sort of 25 million visitors since the power station opened, which is why William and I about a month ago opened a little gift shop and cafe and exhibition within the building. So after this, feel free to go down to the power station. It closes at 6, but it'll be open tomorrow. But we had to change that legacy. Gordon talked about the broken promises. And that building is great, but even after the Malaysians bought the site in 2012, it was nearly a decade before the building opened, and it took a long time to get there. So straight away, what we had to do was start to think about getting as many people on site. So 3 people, as many people as possible, just interact with the building. Stakeholders and community, so a three-strand approach to get different audiences to the site. So this was Red Bull, 28,000 people come to an event in the building. This is all during planning, before it opened, getting people used to the site. Music festivals on the front, movie, so The Dark Knight was filmed there, Batman The Dark Knight, then using the rent that they would pay that to cross-fund other events, snowboarding festivals and music festivals. This was 120,000 people over a weekend for 3 years in a row. Focus events, Elton John, stakeholders, investors, like him or not, giving it to people like David Cameron to launch his manifesto, again to have people's eyes on the building, from stakeholders right through to the local community. Open house. The largest attended open house ever in the history of open house globally. 40,000 people came one Saturday afternoon. We had about 6 people on the gates. It was come to a complete disaster, 5-hour queues. But then Sarah contacted them all afterwards and said, look, if you missed out, you didn't make it through, please come over the following weeks. And then outdoor festivals and concerts, which then led to a very successful phase 1. So all of these events helped us build a brand that people shifted from this will never happen to now going, this will happen, and also actually it's a really, really cool, fun place to hang out, and therefore I might want to live there, because you have to be able to build residential and new buildings to help cross-fund this. So as much as the power station is now a really interesting thing, we had to build this residential building first to cross-fund it. And if you've been to many of the residential buildings in London, particularly on the river, they tend to be lackluster. You get sort of investor or residential homes, there's no ground floor, there's no public offering there. There might be a Tesco Express, there might be a cafe if you're lucky, but more often than not. We knew if we built a residential building with nothing on the ground floor, even in advance of this, we would lose people's trust. They would say, we waited 30 years of the promises that Gordon just talked about, and you've just given us another alienating, empty residential building on the front. And we would never have gone on the successful journey to this. So we had to look at that first building as something that was not just sort of about renting max and taking as much money out of it day one, but how we invest in it to create longer term value. And so, and this might be a bit technical for those who work in real estate, but all the money is up here, right? It's in selling apartments. There's very little money on the ground floor, you know, in terms of getting somebody to rent a cafe and pay you rent on it. So we kind of said to our shareholders, there's 90% of the area is apartments and 10% is commercial. But it's only at 3% of the value, because actually it's only a third of the value above. So what if we gave it away to the most interesting usage? You don't think we could create this destination and then add value onto the rest of the future phase and the development? And they were like, yes, you probably could. So we're not going to give it away. But when we bring you deals and ideas, we want to bring an eclectic mix in that first phase. If I've been down to it even before it opened, it's 25 bars and restaurants and cafes and spin studios and workspaces and a theatre in the Arches and indoor crazy golf and all these different things, and it itself became hugely successful. So these are the 25 tenants that are in phase one that existed for 3 years before the power station ever opened. And so it became this really, really powerful community, and it became a destination. So even before the power station opened and brought in 11 million people a year, phase one was bringing in 3 million visitors a year. Imagine building a residential building in central London with 800 apartments in it and bringing 3 million people to it. It became hugely successful and created that brand. And again, I won't go through this too much, but it's about how there is a science to it by thinking about, okay, here are all these restaurants and bars, and here's how many people I need as a minimum each month before that business goes bust. So if this pizza place doesn't get 3,000 people in a month, they go bust. But you only have 800 apartments, which is not going to succeed in sustaining all these businesses. So what we started to do is put on all these events every month and make sure that you stay above the blue line, which is the minimum people before they go bust. Because if phase one goes bust, you're never going to rent all the retail in phase two, you know, which is 4 times or 10 times as much. So all that curation happened and building these events and building the sort of the support and engaging the community, starting with Wandsworth and then spreading out across the city, putting in public transport, knowing that the tube that Gordon talked about wasn't going to come until the power station opens, and putting in riverboats and complimentary buses and bikes. And this is the difference. So I took this, I lived in Battersea all the way through the development for a decade. This is Nine Elms, this is the power station, this is the exact same Saturday I took this. So an oyster festival and the tennis being screened at the power station. This is before the building is even open. So this is literally just a residential building. There's a power station under construction and thousands of people mulling around and enjoying it as a community, and therefore people want to live and rent there. Whereas Nine Elms, 9 units, put one waitress in there and just said, you know what, we couldn't bother leasing the rest. And so there is that sort of approach of having to invest in the ground floor and curation. And then we found out as a result that people were 3 times more likely to buy if they came down to site. Rather than saying, here's a brochure, buy an apartment. It's like, come down, see what the community is about, come on this journey. And I don't want to make it about too much commercial, but you know, if it isn't commercial and viable, then you have the 3 or 4 failed schemes that Gordon talked about. And as a result, it had amazing commercial success with the rents and the values, but also amazing social success. And thankfully, largely to Sarah at the back, you know, and this doesn't get spoken about enough. You know, in the UK and Irish press, we like to build up a story and then we like to chop you down. But actually, from the thousands of laptops given to local school kids, to the 6 million local charity fund, to the jobs, let alone a tube station, it's had amazing social success and community benefits that aren't spoken about enough. But all of this work on the power station and phase one end up accelerating development so that everything happens quicker. You know, we bring on the Foster building and the Geary building and the tube station. You know, so you start to move things quicker because people become more enticed by the development and want to live there. Probably going to skip the next one, which is talks a little bit about Nine Elms. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but you know, we talk about mixed-use development and kind of mixed-use list. It's a bit unfair, but the point being is that there's a difference between, I think, somewhere like Battersea, where you have all the mixed uses there, so all the retail, all the offices, hotels, people working together. Nine Elms is predominantly single-use residential. It's got the embassy at the centre, but also it's kind of got like single-use. It's disinvested in the ground floor. The residential developers that kind of built the apartments and then kind of left. Slightly shorted. It's disparate ownership, so you maybe have 10 or 15, 20 different developers across that area rather than one person controlling the whole thing and having a multi-stage vision. And it's starting to come good because that's what ultimately happened. Ultimately, people will move in and then they'll say, hey, actually, I want to take over that ground floor unit, or I want to, but it takes much longer, and you've seen it probably taking 10 years, only now getting that momentum within the rest of Nine Elms that you can kind of curate in a way at somewhere like the power station. So I don't want to bash it too much, but it is a slightly different approach. But I think all this, just to summarise the last slide, Nine Elms, this was in 2008, even probably as recently as 2010, and then the huge amount of development, both good and bad, that's happened in the interim. 25 seconds on. That's absolutely
Great, thank you very much, both of you. Both of you. One, what is your favourite bit? What's the bit you're most proud of about the power station? And two, what bit would you do differently? What would you not do again? Gordon.
You have ready answers to this one.
I think my favourite part, it sounds corny, but is just the whole place, the vibe of the place. So like when the power station opened on the 14th of October, and after living in London for 14 years as a result of the power station, I moved home on the 21st, so literally 6 days later. And when I go back to London every other week, I always try and stay in Battersea, and I find an excuse to go there because it is kind of like my favourite place to hang out, and that extends the power station to Battersea Park. I think there's so much that's underestimated about how much Battersea Park does for the Battersea Power Station, because on a Saturday it's like, hey, I'll take my kids to the park and then go somewhere else. So I think it's just the vibe of the place. I think the public realm, that connection, the parks and riverfront.
And what would you do differently? What wouldn't you do again? What's the kind of the... I think I know the answer.
The technical perspective, I think, there was the crest of a wave. It's like phase 1 sold out in 3 weeks. It's amazing. It's like, okay, let's go. Let's get the power station going. Great, let's go. Let's get phase 3 going. And I think, look, we might as well talk about the positives and the negatives. You get that momentum going. It's like, well, okay, have we really talked about how we can get residents in, plus construction, and build that next to this? Like, do you know what? The market's so good, let's just figure it out as we go. And you're like, oh, that was a bit more complicated to figure out than we thought it was, and things take longer, and building a 3-level basement next to the biggest brick building in Europe and trying to stop it falling into the bay. There's like those sort of things. So yes, I think, would we have done it differently? No, but we probably would have maybe had a better delivery plan on that side of it.
Go on.
So I know it's a bit techie, but it meant a lot at the time, and it does tie into my background. So John Broome took down the west wall, the boiler house, and he said, "We promise I'll put it back." And then he went into administration. So from then on, every time we wanted to do something, we'd say, "We'll promise we'll do it." The authorities would say, "That's what John Broome said," and it was very debilitating. When we had to renegotiate the sequencing to replace the chimneys, there was no trust. And sort of jumping to the end, over a 10, 12-year period, we built up a lot of trust. So it was very gratifying to see the first panels of the west wall going back in. I mean, it's a very small element, but it just fed through so much of that sort of planning process and trust process, saying, we promise we will do this, and we did do it. I was going to say the 1, 2, and 3 thing going too quickly, and I don't think it's like what would you do again. It's lessons learned, and there were good reasons. Dave saying it was good reasons for going quickly, doing 1, 2, and 3, but then there just became huge logistical problems of phase 2. Phase 3 wanted to get going, but there was a road going through their site, and phase 2 said, well, we need that road. So it became a bit sort of territorial. So yeah, lots of lessons learned from that. And the other one was, and again, there was a reason for doing it, in that again, it was a trust point. The planners wanted us to do things in an incremental way, and we had the detailed design for the Foster building, but we had to change it, I think, 4 times. It was office, then we changed it to residential, and we designed it as residential, then we changed it back to office, an element of it. So there were good reasons as to why that happened, but looking back, you would do it differently.
Yeah, great.
Hi, Christensen. I'm retired now, but I'm an ex-banker. So, from a project finance point of view, this is a very impressive completion, albeit not entirely complete. Now you're into the part of the business plan where you're going to try to get money back for the investors, and banks repaid. And all of them have sort of an exit horizon. What is the exit horizon for those investors and financial institutions on this project? And is it going to plan?
I'll answer that as diplomatically and confidential, striking the balance with like obviously private business plans and public knowledge. Look, I think on anything of this scale, so first off, one of the biggest challenges of the power station is the size of the check you're writing rather before even the profitability, right? So you take out, you know, it has to take somebody like the Malaysians of that sovereign wealth to do this. Because even if it's profitable, 99% of the market can't even enter into that because, you know, you're talking about billions rather than even tens, hundreds of millions. So that's the first challenge. I think the big advantage that the shareholders had was being able to, and again this is public knowledge, was having your construction loans, and there was a syndicate of 6 banks with Power Station, and then being able to forward sell that investment asset from the 3 shareholders to the state pension fund. So state pension fund going, do you know what, that's a nice asset. It's got all this retail that's leased, it's got a very secure lease to somebody like Apple, and that's something I want to own. So being able to, like, not that it was a family transaction, but being able to forward plan that way of having your exit, that way you're sort of forward selling the building in advance, was a big part in helping realise the building.
Let me put a question differently. Is it going according to plan?
I think
I don't think it was ever going to.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think the shareholders are happy. You've got the first phase was a very proper phase. You've got the power station, which is an investment asset owned by the pension fund. And then the big thing is now you've got another 4 million square feet of fully enabled development sites that have all the infrastructure and tube enabled. So I would imagine, I can't speak for them, but to my best of my knowledge, they're happy.
We might touch on future phases in a bit, and if someone doesn't ask a question on it, I will. But they say no plan survives contact with the enemy, right? So I think that there's a point at which anything like that, you're always going to be dealing with uncertainties, including, as you said, you know, global financial crisis or change in affordable housing requirements, or any of those things are going to you're always going to be responding to.
I'm from a communications agency called Camargue, so we do comms for developments, placemaking, that kind of thing. I know you're telling me it's very different, but I suppose listening to some of what you're saying kind of remind me of some of the stories that Arjun have told about. Thinking about, you know, King's Cross and other kind of large-scale developments and the challenges, failed attempts to bring the schemes forward. Do we have a problem in London about bringing big sites forward? Are we not set up to do it? I mean, you talked about having the political will, but it obviously took a very long time to get there.
I don't think it's a London thing, and I'd only say it's so. Look, you do see some examples. Like, it's often they say it's the first developer goes broke, particularly the infrastructure that kills them, and then the next developer that makes money on it. But it's global, and I'll say, for example, we're working on a project called Lincoln Yards in Chicago, and it's an amazing project. It's 60 acres. It's going to open up and connect Lincoln Yards to Bucktown, so a very wealthy neighborhood, one of the most up-and-coming cool neighborhoods. And we've worked with one of the most passionate developers we've ever had as a client for the last 6 years. And it's backed by JP Morgan, and they've literally last week lost the site. And they are one of the biggest. They're the biggest developer in Chicago, and probably maybe approaching top 10, top 15 in the US. But again, it's infrastructure. It's trying to get TIF, which is the tax increment financing. It's the fact that Chicago doesn't have a real place in the US anymore. Like Boston is pharmaceuticals, and tech is down south, and finance in New York is like, you know, it used to be the big nationals, Boeing and banks, and it's not. And so you see rumors about Hudson Yards, very famous development in New York, that actually that first phase, everything they built to date, just pays for the deck for the second half of the development. So I think unless, we do a lot of work in the Middle East, where it's different because there's a lot more, like somewhere like Abu Dhabi, oil money, but also it's not democracy or not democracy, but the leadership, we do presentations to them there, they're talking about 100 years, 150 years, they're future planning. And so I think maybe democratic countries or that sort of structures are or struggled because it has to be
I'd also say, I know
market-led?
you didn't pay to hear from me, but I would also say that London has done amazing stuff. If you go through Canary Wharf, Wood Wharf, Paddington, King's Cross, Battersea Power Station, to Brent Cross. I mean, we've done, and look at the centre, just look at the skyline behind us. I think actually we beat ourselves up about how long it takes. It should take a long time. Because if it doesn't take a long time, generally bad decisions get made. You're not taking into account all of the local context. And also, the other problem they do in the Middle East, they try to go too fast, and they don't realise that absorption is absolutely critical. So I had a conversation with Eric Sorensen, who did Canary Wharf as part of the LLDC, and he said, oh, we should have done Bermondsey at the same time. We should have done Canada Water at the same time. It's like you couldn't have done it. Right? You needed to kind of create that market. You need to fill it up. You need to make it successful, and then you move on to the next one. So I don't think it's necessarily quite as bleak.
I would add a slightly different line to it by first responding with a question to you, which I'll answer. Is, would Battersea happen today? And I don't think it would, because what I was alluding to in my presentation about that coalition of people coming together and taking risks. There is a very limited appetite for risk at all levels, whether it's public, private, or whatever, to put your neck on the line. And everyone did back then, like when, and it was a sort of a transition between, I guess, Treasury Holdings days and then Battersea, but it kind of crystallised with the Malaysians, whereby we will buy it, the mayor will take out £1 billion loan, the two leaders will back it, and the private investors said we will step up and we will deliver it. It just feels that right at this moment there isn't any of that, and there is. And I may come on to this on another question if it comes up, but the political alignment helped at the time that I joined, blue top to bottom. So the council, the MP, the mayor, the government was all Conservative. That helps. But at the moment, Wandsworth from top to bottom is all red, and I don't think it would happen today.
It's really important, and I can say this not having the same association with Battersea Power Station. The leader of Wandsworth Council didn't want to visit site after he took office, right? Thinking that somehow Battersea had taken away from Wandsworth. I find it completely extraordinary because I think Battersea is one of the most creative projects. I don't mean creative like creativity. I mean it created things in Wandsworth to the most extraordinary extent. And if you think, I think there's a King's Cross comparison, was quite an interesting one. King's Cross had two of the busiest railway stations in Europe. It had an immense amount of investment through the government at the Wellcome Institute, at the Crick, at the British Library, which took 35 years. Right? All of this stuff happened, and the developers came in and they developed all this stuff around it. They kind of reaped the benefit. Battersea, none of that, zero, right? An incredibly expensive derelict building needing to come to life. A tube station needed to be delivered in a place that had no current workforce, Norman Foster being the largest employer. So what's been created there is absolutely extraordinary, and yet some people say, oh, well, there's, the affordable housing percentage is a bit small. Affordable housing percentage is absolutely critical if you're just delivering residential with no other added benefit, but actually the residential at Battersea Power Station is almost the least valuable bit. It's almost the least exciting bit about what it's done to London, and I think that is it's not really told, it's not really understood. I think people have this idea that, all development is bad. No, some development is phenomenally valuable for London in that broader sense. And so I think that there's this kind of political sense that somehow, still it's like, developer bad, they're just trying to take things from us, which is just patently not true.
Hi Nick, I work for Stanton Williams as a social value lead. I'm also an architectural artist and model maker. My question's a little bit different in that I was wondering about the teams behind all these projects, and you mentioned creativity. I wonder whether you see it as a creative job, and I wonder whether there's any skill gaps for people coming up through, whether this is a thing that people can study for, or whether this sounds really creative, entrepreneurial, the work that you do, and whether it's just do it, or I don't know a lot about this. I'm sorry if this is a silly question.
But yeah, because we had seen what you guys did in King's Cross, and it was awesome. I think there is an emerging skill set. I guess the work we do is you've got hardware and software, and we're really, really good as an industry at hardware. The developer understanding physically what they need in order to make a site stack up, and then an architect translate that to design. I think what we've lacked as an industry for a long time is the software, those skills about ground floor programming or activation, or how you retail it, the experience side. And I think that's something that we're starting to see emerge the last couple of years, and you probably see when you get, in the last 2 or 3 years, when we get RFPs now to like, you know, a job comes out, a tender basically for a new project. Traditionally, it would have been like we did the power station, run an architectural type tender. Whereas now, so many of them more, you see they want these multi sort of disciplined hybrid teams. You want placemaking with public space activation, with public art, with architect, with landscape, because they want that more holistic, differentiated vision. I think there is a real sort of shift now in that direction with sort of new skill sets.
And I think it's super interesting, particularly the Battersea model, and I think that it's not a coincidence that one of the longest standing employees is somebody who works in community, right? And has how many, you know, they used to say that Roger Madeleine at King's Cross has spoken to 20,000 people. I think Sarah's probably spoken to 250,000 people, right? So embedded in the organisation is that idea of social interaction, and that's not very developer-y. I think also Battersea, when it started, and Dave talked about it in some of the slides, there were films shot there were snowboarding events, there were events. And so in the first 5 or 6 employees, there were events, there was an events team. There were people whose job it was to get people there, to make sure they were looked after and show them how that team came to life. So when the development company grew and started doing the hardware, they had software embedded, right? They knew what events looked like. They thought like an events company. They thought like an experience business. So to your point around creativity, absolutely. But the only way we deliver places like that successfully is by diversity, not just in thought and, you know, the fact that people look different and they come from different places so that we don't all design what we know, but also diversity in input, because ultimately Battersea will not be remembered because of the buildings above the ground floor, right? It won't be remembered because of the apartments. It will be ready for the lives that it changes, for the things that happen there, for the legacies that it creates inside those buildings. So I think that absolutely it's a creative exercise. It has to be, otherwise you don't deliver something successful, but it is mainly about the software and about what happens in it.
Add to that is that I don't think there is a textbook on how to set up a development company. My experience with public sector, and I'm not a creative person. I am in awe and get a lot from the creative people and watch that unfold. But what I would say is what was critical for Battersea, is just to speak from my experience, is having that team on site in the one office who were passionate and determined. You know, that doubt, the people that joined were the ones that were going to prove the doubters wrong and say, you know, I know the industry is saying it'll never happen, but we believe it will. And there is something in that sort of collective, sort of tribal mentality of working together to achieve an unachievable outcome and do it in a really creative way.
I think the thing you talked there about people's connection to the object is really important. And actually, if the residents that live there now, well, they complain about service charge prices because, of course, you've got to complain about something. But everybody loves being a resident at the power station. Dave lived there for 6 months before he went back to Ireland. Said he'd never worked in a place that was so friendly and where so many people spoke to you and said hello. The same is true of the people that work there, whether it's in the development company or within the shops around it. People are phenomenally proud of being associated with the power station, not just the stuff that happened, but its rebirth and what has been delivered to it. And I think that it was a tough place to work, right? You said relentless, right? Relentless delivery, and people talk a little bit about trauma bonding, right? Battersea Power Station, PTSD, because it is just bang, bang, deliver, and you're spending at one point £1 million a day in construction. It is a stressful environment in which to do stuff, and yet people stuck around for very long periods of time because they really, really can. And I think there's a big part of it. Dave said, kind of went over it, but I think it's super important. Dave lived in Battersea for 12 years, right? So he walked to work. So actually that place mattered to Dave, right? And I think it's a drive.
So he was nothing.
But right, I think it mattered, right? You lived there, right? It was your neighbourhood. It was an important part. It's Sarah's neighbourhood, right? It makes it matters. Did you live in Battersea, Gordon?
I still do.
Well, there you go, right? Look at that. That says something, right? All those people, they live there.
I'm Ross Logie, I'm an architect here. You mentioned 4 million square feet still to be built, so I'm sort of interested in what you can tell about what's coming in the future phases, and also if, given the lessons learned and the success of what you've built already, whether that's been reviewed and revised since initial planning applications.
Yes, I can say that there is remaining in phases 4, 5, 6, and 7, and that takes 3.5, 4 million square feet. each phase has a different sort of very different character. So the next one is phase 4, is next to the tube. Backtracking one bit, one of the last things I did before going was to change the rest of the master plan based on the first 10 years of experience. From the beginning, everything was fixed, like that building's going to be residential, that building's going to be office, it's going to be shaped like that. But we learned that, market change and all that sort of thing. So we changed the future phases to be flexible to respond to the market. So the next phase, phase 4, is next to one of the tube entrances. So could be commercial, could have some other uses, could be residential. It's a big phase. One of the changes was to make it so they could be delivered in smaller chunks, because if you did it in the one shape of the Raphael Vignoli master plan originally, it would be £1 billion to go in one go, and that's just no longer feasible. Phase 5 are 2 satellite sites that are recently returned from Thames Water, because as well as everything else, the super sewer was built next door to us, and Thames Water took 2 of the phase compounds, recently got that back. Phase 6 is the mirror to phase 1. So Dave talked a lot about phase 1, which is the sort of display. There is a matching one.
Circus West.
Yeah. Circus West, yeah. So there will be a Circus East eventually, which will mirror and go on the other side and wrap around the wharves. And then lastly is phase 7, which is another satellite site on the river, which has also recently just come back from Thames Water. So each unique in its own way.
Does it include building over Kringle Dock? Is that part of it?
Kringle, no. So phase 6 is adjacent. You were very well informed. Phase 6 is adjacent to Kringle Dock.
Oh, okay.
And Kringle Dock is the waste transfer station. So the waste from 4 boroughs is taken there by truck and then compacted and taken away by river. And it was built in 1972. Really could do with some updating. And next door is Kirtling Wharf, which was the drive side for the super sewer. So I'm sure there is a solution about how a new facility could be built, but watch this space.
I'll say a little thing just again about future phases, because we went back and did some work on future phases and what they might be. And a lot of work was done initially about character areas on the site. And right down to small streets, right? So you go through Arches, the Arches has a very particular character, Circus West has a particular character, and Dave could do a whole bit on the shop fronts and why the shop fronts are the way they are and why they're different from the buildings above. But also thinking about how you go into the future phases, how each of those streets respond. So residents in phase 1, when the power station opened, were like, hang on a second, we just used to live in this really nice programmed village next to the river. Suddenly 12 million people a year are arriving, right? It massively changes that character. You go into future phases, do you want to live next to the power station? Do you want to live in the power station? Do you want to be somewhere quiet? Do you want to be somewhere busy? Is it going to have lots of retail? So those next phases, thinking about how do you respond to the success of what has been and what's going on now, and then see how you respond to those. And I also think it's worth thinking, you go there around there now, it's busy and it's half built. Right? Double the number of residents, double the number of workers, double the number of people, and see what happens in those spaces and how they come to life, and again transform the borough already to an huge extent.
Paul Williams, Stanton Williams Architects. Thank you for this evening. That's great. I'm interested in this north-south divide. Was there an issue at all being south of the river? I mean, we've got British Land are endeavouring to develop Canada Water, which is going to be interesting because they don't have a Battersea Power Station. Nine Elms doesn't have much there. Obviously, you talked about King's Cross, and that's a development that had its stations, but you also had the Olympics, which kicked it off. I just wondered, is south of the river a problem still, or for you, it was never an issue?
At a certain level, it absolutely isn't now. I think that the brand of Battersea is very strong. I think historically you would have seen a lot of people, second generation young people in Chelsea, Westminster, who couldn't afford to live where they grew up, would have gone west, Ealing. I think a lot of them are now going south. And I think the role that the park plays in that, because I lived on the park for years, played football 3 days a week, is unparalleled. I think they almost become a stepping stone for like, because a lot of people were just coming down, they were really just going to play football in the park. And then the power station came, and these two things kind of created that real energy. You know, once you cross over Battersea Park Road, you know, we talked earlier on, you know, you have that dissipation, and we talked about how that continues to extend and how you bring it down. So I think you have this little microcosm of where the river kind of bends to the south side of the park, and the power station, it's kind of gone that far, and how it continues, and you know, particularly with, you know, some of the post-war states, and then how they become improved and become stepping stones. So I feel that around the power station, almost the river now goes to the southern boundary of the park and the power station. And it was a challenge originally. I mean, Sarah, you did it a lot longer than I, but I remember used to getting taxis home in 2006, 7 from town. It was like crossing the river, was like, I'm not fucking, like, you know, it's either like, I'll get a different taxi or I'll drop you at the bridge kind of thing.
Used to talk around value as well, that there's a chasm in value and residential value between just over Battersea Bridge.
That's a really good point. So when we bought the power station as Treasury Holdings in 2008, it was 400 million for 40 acres. Around that correct? 10 million acre. And it was about 3 months before the Candy brothers bought Chelsea Barracks, which is 800 metres from the edge of the site. So the most expensive plot of land ever bought at 90 million an acre was 800 metres from the edge of the site further on. I mean, that just averages 9 times per acre. And in terms of residential sales values, north of the river you would have had 2,500, 3,000 an acre, and south you would have had 650, 750 when we started. But I think that hasn't closed, but it's vastly closed. Like
Any thoughts north-south divide?
Well, I'm Australian, so I didn't really understand the north-south divide. It had to be taught to me. But I think what I would just add to it is that I think it's talked about a lot less now. And certainly, sort of thinking back, I can't remember it sort of being something was discussed a lot. There's a technical point which no one will know looking, because you know, lines on maps that you can't see them on the ground. But as part of the opportunity area, the central activity zone boundary was brought down south of the river, which was a key thing for investment, because then you get CAS uses and CAS designation. That's more of a sort of planning issue that you wouldn't notice on the ground. But the last one is it's changed by other key changes, one being the US Embassy. So them moving from Grosvenor Square to Nine Elms was a game changer. Even though geographically it's closer in Nine Elms to the Houses of Parliament than it was when it was in Mayfair. But I think those sort of key measures help change perception.
I know, we know Apple wouldn't have gone without the tube station, so I think that they needed to. And London's north-south divide is affected by the dearth of tube stations on that site. I do think it's really interesting. Back in the day when you used to go for meetings at Battersea Power Station, everyone used to turn up 20 minutes early because they think it would take them 40 minutes to get there and only take 20, because everybody had the perception that it was miles away.
But of course, British Land are trying to present Canada Water as very close to the city, which it is actually, as the crow flies. It's closer to a lot of places, you know, in the centre than in the north of the river.
Yeah.
But it's a hard one to crack.
It is,
Because there is still, I mean, I agree the sort of that idea of north-south has broken down a lot, but it's still around.
Yeah. And Canada Water doesn't have the benefit of being on the river, right? At least the Battersea is looking into the north side.
My name's Chris White, and I'm not an architect. I work in the fruit business and occupy the building, the only tall building in the area, Market Towers, for 25 years, and I'm actually a local resident. So the reason I live in Battersea is because I could see the chimneys from my living room. And I was interested, and I'm really pleased to have heard all the things, because it's worked for somebody who lives very close to the power station but not in the development. And my interest was almost in wondering about how these phases work in terms of those bits that aren't part of the master plan, that are kind of next to the master plan, and what consideration, I don't mean from a consulting residents and stuff like that, but the measurement you might take of the impact that it has in those areas that are just off the site, and how you measure that, or is that a consideration, not just to this plan, but any plan that one does? Because, for example, there's the where I work on the fruit market, which is this massive site next to the power station. I keep on hoping it'll become some big food quarter that it really could become, which would also be transformative for local residents.
Lobby your local council.
I'm
Sarah, do you
very
want
happily do
to say something about the areas outside the master plan and the local community?
Well, all I'd
You
say
don't have to. You didn't
is
sign up to
just
this.
We focus on people, and it's, you know, it's making sure that there isn't a red line, and that the benefits flow out, and that people feel welcome to come back in. And it's about job creation. It's about economic, sort of like rings falling out across the area. I think it's very much more on that sort of people focus. That's my job anyway, it's the people focus.
And I think it does work from that point of view, as somebody who lives just the beyond and has lived there for nearly 40 years, the way the area has been transformed.
I think it's interesting because in the beginning there were, if you Googled Battersea Power Station 15 years ago, the first hit you got was no development of Battersea Power Station. It was the Battersea Power Station anti-development lobby, and there were lots of people who didn't want anything to happen. And so I think you had to go out and do this incredible amount of community consultation. And I always think the amazing thing about Battersea was at hyperlocal. We call it hyperlocal consultation, right? Speaking to people, local schools, people first, and getting those to come in. And again, in phase one, it had to be people who could walk because there was no tube station, right? It had to be people who could come from very close. So immediately, all the things were catering for people who live south of the river, who found it easy to get to. And that's when it was that, the great saying, make those that are near happy and those that are far will come.
It's gone from a point of people saying, what the hell would you want to live there for? Blimey, you're so lucky.
Yeah.
You live there.
I think, not speaking on behalf of Battersea Power Station, because I'm not empowered to, and this is definitely not a Battersea Power Station comment, but I think it's also like politics needs to get out of the way. I think, look, I'm not neither blue nor red, I'm Irish, but you had a 38 years of continuous conservative governance of Wandsworth, and therefore, whether you agreed or not, but they had an agenda they could see through it. I think you have a Labour council who've obviously just come in, who may have that same 30 years, but you need to have that long view to be able to think about how to affect change. And at the moment, I think, again, as I said, the point I made at the start, but there doesn't have to be one vision for a site, but you can't change. So the Conservatives were like, it's about jobs, but taking the parts about the tube. Whereas Labour, if they had been around in 28, they might have said, it's about residential, we don't care about the tube, we want residential, we want higher affordable housing, so therefore you would have done something different. You can't change in the middle, and therefore I think this council feels that it's not their power station in some ways, and therefore are less maybe interested in leveraging the benefits of going, okay, well, how do you take Apple and leverage a tech quarter around it, for example, or whatever the idea might be. But I think you kind of go, it's there now, it's happened, it's in my borough, I am here for the next 30 years, if they are, let's engage with them then. So I think to rekindle those benefits, you have to, that has to be.
Look, it's when we started, we were having a chat outside before you were going to, I don't know whether you were going to say this, we were talking about Gordon working in Southwark with, and coming after Fred Manson, the great planner of Southwark, who was responsible for the Shard coming, but also for Tate Modern, and going to the council and saying, I need £1 million to do a feasibility study to turn Tate Modern into an art gallery. And all of the Labour councillors saying, no, it's ridiculous, £1 million, I could change all the windows, or I can do this, that and the other. And he said, well, you could, and no one would tell you off, and everybody would think it was the right and worthy thing to do. However, maybe there's some other thing to do. I've stolen the story.
No.
And Fred said to Gordon, yeah, that's right, except it was £2 million. And so I think it's that opportunity to recognising those things, those benefits can come from lots of different places. And you're right, long-term thinking. Great, thank you very much indeed.